honor to be here today to introduce the session on climate change and food insecurity. As you know, there is increasing urgency and alarm about what has become a more and more prominent scientific consensus around climate change. Air temperatures are on the rise, water temperatures as well, storms are getting stronger, ice is melting, sea levels are on the rise, and the oceans are becoming more and more acidic. Recently we heard the clarion call of a Swedish teenager that change is coming whether we like it or not. The signs come to our own neighborhood. If you've been to Kansas City, you might know Interstate 29. There are farms on both sides. Interstate 29 has been flooded for a number of months. Farms have been washed out. We've had to move from a mindset of prevention to adaptation to deal with disruptions that are coming from many, many different sides. The water supply is being disrupted. Coastal communities are having to migrate. Ecosystems are changing and the environment is under attack. Transportation is becoming a challenge, and energy is something that we need to think about as well. This conference is focused on the global economy and what we can do to prepare for the disruptions that are coming and the changes that we're seeing. And food security is certainly at the heart of that. Whether it's production, supply, nutrition, food security, and the challenges posed by climate change are the topic for our panel today. We were so pleased to be visited by Phil Karsting, who you'll hear from in just a minute, from the World Food Program USA, and others from his organization in May in Kansas City. There we connected the breadbasket of America to what's happening around the world with responses to global hunger, and we know that that need is not going away. In just a minute, Phil, who is the president and CEO of World Food Program USA, previously worked as the Foreign Agricultural Service Administrator for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, will share some remarks with you. We're also very, very grateful to be joined by other distinguished panelists, including Melissa Ho, Senior Vice President for Freshwater and Food at WWF US. She previously focused on infrastructure investments in Africa, as well as Kimberly Flowers, Director of the Humanitarian Agenda and the Global Food Security Project at the Center for International and Strategic Studies. Her career is focused on hunger eradication and international development work. Our moderator today will be Susan Schram, a senior partner at SP Consulting, a consultant in global food security with a breadth of experience in the government, academic, and non-governmental sectors. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Phil.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. I'm grateful to be with you today. And I'm even more grateful for the sorts of conversations that we're going to be having next year in collaboration with the World Affairs Councils. We're working on a plan to take this message and have these conversations in more places. It will be no slam against New York and Washington, but sometimes here it seems like we talk to ourselves a lot. It's nice to get outside the Acela corridor and have some of these conversations. Before we get started into climate and my presentation, I thought I might lead off with two basic questions so you get to know who we are and what we do, and answer what is the World Food Program USA, and then more interestingly, what is the United Nations World Food Program? World Food Program USA is a 501c3 founded here in the United States to support the mission of the United Nations World Food Program. So we do that by generating financial support. We do that by advocating for policies that alleviate hunger. And we do that by educating Congress, where I will say that support for global food work has been bipartisan and strong for many years. There are not so many topics you can say that about, but our support in Congress has been bipartisan and bicameral and strong for a long time. The more interesting question is, what is the United Nations World Food Program? As you know, it's a UN-based agency, but it's based in Rome. It has about 16,000 people. Most of those are outside of Rome, in places like Yemen and Syria and the Dry Corridor and every other place where there's a big food-related disaster. It is about, on any given day, WFP has about 5,000 trucks on the road. It has about 92 aircraft, which is as large as the fleet of Alitalia Airlines. It has 20 ships on the ocean at any one time, and in short, it is a logistics behemoth. It is also the logistics coordinator for the other humanitarian agencies at the United Nations, as well as other NGOs. So when a disaster strikes, it's often WFP acting as a global first responder, arriving with containers and tents and generators and communications equipment and mapping and all those sorts of things that you need to do to deliver relief in a more efficient and modern way. WFP is often the last line for a person in a difficult place between them and starvation. They serve 15 billion meals a year to about 90 million people in about 83 different countries. So I think all of those numbers are incredibly impressive, but I also reflect on things I've seen, and if you are a young couple fleeing violence in Syria with a toddler and an infant in tow, or if you're one of 1.4 million people in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, in what we call the dry corridor, who have had successive years of drought caused by climate. Or if you're sitting knee-deep in rubble and the corrugated roof of your hut is twisted and blown off somewhere in the wake of Hurricane Dorian, you don't really care about how many trains, trucks, ships, anything anybody has. What you're really most interested about is where's your next meal coming from. And so, sadly, that question of where's your next meal coming from applies to about 820 million people across the globe. We throw around a lot of statistics, and sometimes I think it's hard for us to capture what is 820 million people. But if you can imagine every man, woman, and child in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan, that's 820 million people, give or take. So imagine all the populations of those countries not knowing where their next meal is coming from. So that's the view from 50,000 feet. I'm going to ask to show a quick little video here on climate and WFP, and then I'll come back in and make a few remarks. So, as you might imagine, WFP thinks a lot about hunger and global stability, and responding to crises like this really isn't enough. We have to think about root causes and resilience and all those things. And we know for a fact that conflict and climate are the two, by far, biggest drivers to hunger around the globe. So before we begin our dialogue on climate, I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, I want to emphasize, as that video did, that climate effects will affect all of us, but it will hit the poor especially hard. 80% of the world's hungry people live in disaster-prone countries. Many of them are smallholder farmers. We think of agriculture in America as this big, gleaming production power plant, but in many countries, smallholder farmers still form the backbone of their internal food systems. Many of these farmers don't have irrigation, and conversely, they don't have flood control or water retention structures to get them to even out the harsh times between the rainy season and the dry season. They don't have quality inputs like good seed, good fertilizer. They don't have the safety nets that we enjoy. So one bad year, many of them don't collect a crop insurance payment to help bridge them over to the next year. One bad year followed by another bad year, it really begins to snowball, and their hardships compound. The second point I want to make is that production losses are real and they are significant. The World Bank in 2015 said that across the globe and across all cropping systems, production will fall by 5% by 2030, and it will fall by 30% by 2080. Of course, those reductions aren't spread evenly across the globe. They're much more severe in equatorial tropics. In places like Nebraska, where I'm from, the tip and tail of the growing season may change some, and we will have floods, as Matthew mentioned. But for farmers in these difficult areas, there really isn't room for error, and a disaster can be deadly. The third thing that I want us to think about is that there are other ways besides flood and drought and extreme weather that climate change will affect global food systems. Obviously, rising sea level will lead to more saltwater intrusion into farmland in coastal areas and on islands, and so that's a problem. Pests and diseases are going to migrate around differently. A slug or some sort of novel plant disease is a hassle for a hobby gardener or for a golf course manager, but for a farmer on the margins, it can be disastrous and it can even be life-threatening. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the food itself. There's a body of research that says, increasing CO2 levels will dramatically, or can dramatically diminish zinc and iron in rice, for instance. 175 million people could become zinc deficient. 122 million could become protein deficient. And so the food that we do grow may become less nutritious, harder to come by, and will compound competition for land and water, which is a recipe for conflict. So where does that leave us? Obviously, we've got a lot of work to do. WFP, I want to focus on one thing that we're doing right now, and this is one of many, 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 but this is in the Sahel. Now, the Sahel is that piece of real estate between, just below the Sahara Desert. It runs from Senegal in the west to Djibouti on the east. We know that the Sahara Desert is creeping south by about a mile each year, and places like Nigeria has been described as a good country and a tough neighborhood. They're surrounded they've got porous borders. Boko Haram works there, Al-Qaeda works there. They can make life miserable for poor people. They can also prey upon a huge cohort of young people in a country like that. And so recognizing that this is sort of one of the ground zero spots for climate change, WFP, along with others, have undertaken a massive effort to create these things. They don't look like a lot. Those are what we call half moons. They fill with water in the rainy season. If you were to see this months later, it would be crowded with trees and grass and all kinds of things. And this has really helped diminish conflict between the pastoralists and farmers, and it has really changed the landscape here. About 400 households in this example transformed 3,000 acres, and it's been very important in reducing tension in the area. So that's just one example of the sort of programs that WFP undertakes to build resilience and to get at root causes. They do a lot of other really cool stuff that I don't have time to get into here. A lot of innovation is going on to alleviate hunger, utilizing satellite data, drones, cell phones, blockchain technology, to do all kinds of things like mitigate disasters, to provide information to farmers when they need it, to stop disasters or to stop them before they become full-blown problems, and to target benefits to people so that benefits get to beneficiaries as efficiently as possible. So I think there is reason for us to look forward to some advances, but it's going to take a lot of collective effort in technology and innovation. So to wrap up, since I ended up on technology, I want to show you another piece of technology and introduce you to something. This is called Share the Meal. You are more than welcome to take out your phone and grab a picture of this, or go to your app, buy an app or download an app. The Share the Meal allows people to learn about global food issues. It allows you to make donations as much as 50 cents, which is enough to feed a kid for a day. You can connect directly with countries and see what's going on in different places around the world. So I think it's a really powerful tool. So I encourage you all to explore it. And with that, I will turn it over to Susan.
Guess we'll test. I guess the mics are working. Very good. Well, thank you so much, Phil. I love your presentation. There's nothing like the power of visualization to really break down a lot of complex ideas. It's really excellent. I also liked your presentation because it was so positive, and it really indicates that this is something we can do something about, and we can work on it together. This issue is so complicated, and you can work on a lot of different pieces of this issue and still be working on this problem. Before we start and move to Kimberly's comments and Melissa's comments, they're each going to give a little 5-minute presentation reacting to what Phil had to say and also adding work about what they're doing and the good work of their organizations. I really wanted to thank Bill Clifford and the councils for bringing us here today, and especially for elevating us to one of your 8 forces. I'm so impressed and just thrilled, really, to be here. Thank you. As Phil noted, those of us in DC certainly have been going to a lot of seminars lately and reading a lot of United Nations reports about this issue of climate change and food insecurity, but I really don't think the word has gotten out that much across our country. And I really think that your councils are a fantastic way to do that. I'm so thrilled, too, about the subject matter partnership that you could have with WFP. We need an intelligent conversation, and we need to get to the public. And we need to have that conversation based in research, not just wild statements about what climate change might be. And we really need to focus in on the whole food security angle of climate change. Climate change is a huge problem, but climate change and food insecurity is really much a very significant global threat. What is our schedule today? I'd like to just say a couple of things about what we intend to do. We're here for a very short time together, but I think we can get some things done. First, I'll tell you what we don't want to do. This is a very complex and, in many cases, a tragic issue. But we don't want to confuse you, and we don't want to depress you. But what we do want to do, I think in a short time that we have, we can provide an overview of this issue and its many component parts. I think we can convey that it is serious and it's urgent. I think we can make connections to a lot of other important issues that you might not have realized. I think we can give some examples of ongoing work, especially where leadership on this issue has made a positive difference. And finally, at the end, for about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll make an attempt to answer some of your questions. So, as I said, our schedule is the following. Kimberly and Melissa will each speak for 5 minutes, and then I will pose a few questions to our panel, and we'll discuss those on the stage, and then we'll switch to audience questions. I'd like to mention a couple of caveats. We have wonderful people on this stage, and they are seasoned policy people. None of us, however, are bench scientists. And so if you really seek to delve into the scientific aspects of this, I recommend that you even do something as simple as a Google search on scholarly documents, and you will come up with amazing documents on this. We recommend especially all the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We will be referring to that as the IPCC. Sometimes these acronyms can be a bit confusing. Reports by the FAO, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, also excellent. And certainly any reports that have been done by the organizations of the folks represented on this panel, and their homepages are also excellent references. The second caveat I would like to mention is that we're going to be discussing developing countries a lot today because that's where the impact is the most serious. But I don't want to leave the impression that this doesn't impact us here at home. Cynthia Rosenzweig in the recent IPCC report talks about the potential for failure of multiple breadbaskets. And this is about trade. We are so dependent on trade these days to access food. And it is possible that multiple breadbaskets can be highly impacted by climate disasters at the same time. And this is going to cause problems here, it's going to cause problems in Europe, globally, developing countries everywhere. So it's not what we're talking about people over there, we're talking about us, we're talking about the globe. Okay, so Kimberly, we look forward to hearing some words about CSIS's work in climate change and food insecurity, and particularly how it's impacting the most vulnerable and how it's what you like to call a threat multiplier. And also, I hope you will include some examples from your work at CSIS. We want to show that when leadership is taken and good ideas are applied, we can do something about these problems. So
Great.
Take it away for about 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Phil. Speaking of reports, I do want to hold up, and I'm going to totally call out my colleague Eilish, who's in the audience. She's there. Raise her hand. This is a report that we just released a few weeks ago on climate change and food security. So if this topic interests you and you want a quick, dirty, not dirty, but a quick policy brief, feel free to grab this, as well as just Google my name and CSIS, and you will find a lot that we've done recently on food security. I think the first thing I want to emphasize, Phil already said it, but I just feel really compelled to speak a little bit more on it, is just the fact that the people that are going to be hurt the most from what is happening right now are the people with the least. It is those in the most vulnerable countries that are going to be impacted by this, mostly smallholder farmers, but others as well. And it just is going to create a continued deepening gap in our world's inequality, which quite frankly just feels very unfair when it's mostly the industrialized countries who are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions that are forcing this to happen. I want to dive a little bit deeper specifically in thinking about this in the dry corridor and thinking through how this links to migration, just to add another twist, another thing to see how this can link into other issues that we're all thinking about. Before I go into that, I didn't call this a threat multiplier myself, although I love that phrase and I do say it, but I steal that from actually the intelligence and defense community, because the US government in those categories are recognizing that climate change is a real threat to our national security. It's a threat to global instability, and that's important as we think about how to get policymakers and others to pay attention to this issue from multiple lenses. What I want to dive into a little bit more specifically is thinking about how this links into the worlds that we don't know as well. So when we think about the dry corridor, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, I want to point out that just in the last year, because of prolonged droughts and because of heavy rains, more than half of the maize and beans have been destroyed there. And there's a lot of linkages that I think are just missing in the conversation when we think about migration, of how this is all connected. There was speaking of World Food Program, they also do a lot of great analysis. There was a World Food Program survey that found that half of Central American migrants left their countries because of a lack of food. And this massive irregular migration that we're feeling, and of course in areas beyond just the Northern Corridor, is a direct consequence of these climate shocks and these food insecurities. Now, of course, there's a lot of other factors as well to consider, but it's really these fluctuating temperatures and these unpredictable rainfalls that are the killers. And it's hard because there isn't that same urgency as you might feel from, say, a man-made conflict or a war, but it's this continued that droughts are lasting longer than before, that you have countries where 70% of certain regions are dependent on rain-fed agriculture for their livelihood. And what does that mean for a family when they not only have lost their entire harvest, but their income? And what are they going to do? They usually migrate a couple of times before to different cities or different areas looking for other work before they may migrate all the way up north. And some of this also has to do with pests and diseases. When Phil was talking about that in terms of, sorry, I feel like my microphone is flipping a little bit. When you were talking about pests and diseases, I was reminded, I was in Bangladesh maybe 3 years ago doing some field research looking at food security and nutrition programs. It happened to be while I was there that it was the first time they had discovered a wheat fungus. And they'd never seen it before in that country. And unfortunately, some farmers had been convinced to try out a new crop. And so they had stopped growing something else, they started growing wheat, and then 90% of their crops were completely destroyed by this new fungus that had never been seen before. And in the end, it took scientists quite some time to figure out where it really came from, but it was an increase of temperatures. It was that borders cannot stop this. And we're starting to see new pests and diseases throughout the world in different countries crop up, and that's going to continue to happen and threaten our food supply. I'll stop there so I don't go on for too long, and I'll jump back later in terms of stability and US leadership.
Thank you. Actually, we're doing pretty well. We're right on
Oh, good.
schedule.
Great.
Okay, let's hear from Melissa. Melissa brings in the whole area of the important natural resources, working for the World Wildlife Fund, of course, and we really want to hear about your work at the nexus of agriculture and natural resources and climate change. So we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks. And I'm actually not going to cover the full extent of WWF's portfolio on food, but more of maybe provide a different angle that is adds to the complexity beyond climate change with food. This is a cheesy question, but how many people have eaten today? How many people went to the Chicago lunch, right? Right. So I think we think about food as so personal. It has cultural values. There's individual tastes. We have, like we like to say, 7 billion experts on food on the planet, right? At the same time, food systems are global. Food stakeholders are corporate. They are producers. They have a huge expansiveness of the range of actors in food systems that even though you are a food expert in what you eat, understanding and connecting the dots between food systems and how they affect the planet, how other people have access or not to food, how the food system works globally is quite convoluted and complex. And so at WWF, folks may or may not know us. We have a very iconic logo. It happens to be an iconic species, so people associate our brand with saving wildlife, which is part of our biodiversity, is part of our DNA. But I think for WWF's interest in food systems and food security, it is as much about the people that rely on the food systems as it is about the landscapes and the habitats that food systems need to continue to produce that food. And so people are at the heart of our mission, and the landscapes and habitat and ecosystem services, as well as the species for us, which are the indicator of how healthy and balanced that system is. And so I think the dots I wanted to connect on food security that folks may or may not know, and that's what this panel is about, and the extra added layer that WWF brings to the table. So agriculture is at the nexus of really big dialogues next year that are happening globally. Some of them you may or may not know. WFP and the great work they do is at the heart of making sure there are no longer hungry and malnourished and poor people in the world. So we have a whole bunch of sustainable development goals that are tried to drive governments to make commitments to end poverty and hunger. So of course, agriculture is at the center of that. Agriculture is also at the center of debates on the Paris climate agreements, and we're hearing a lot about that right now with the administration's solidification that the US is pulling back. We knew that was coming, but and there's a lot of action as WWF we are doing with non-state actors to make sure we stay in the game as a US population. But agriculture is a huge contributor to emissions, as well as agriculture is going to be impacted with climate change. Temperatures, water, all the effects climate change is having is affecting our pollinators, affecting yields, has so much impact on ag. And a quarter of the emissions are from ag, mostly animal systems. So there's a lot of debate on what you should eat, why you should eat it, is it climate friendly, et cetera. So that's another big debate. And the third one, which is where WWF really comes into play in elevating the conversation that's happening next year, is around nature, and where agriculture has a role for driving issues around challenges we are facing as a planet on planetary boundaries and nature. So climate is important for sustainability, but it's also water, land, our air, right? It's pollution. And so we know climate is happening, but in the short term, we also want to make sure we don't give up our ecosystem services, our freshwater systems, groundwater, et cetera. And so that is a whole other agenda that global leaders with the Convention on Biological Diversity will also be speaking about next year and making commitments to 2030. And so there's a nexus where ag fits in. And so as WWF, a lot of our work on ag is about convening stakeholders across the table, private sector for sure, but producers, communities, people that consume food, people that grow it, people that sell it, people that package it, all of the whole system. We're also looking about highlighting the best innovations we can find, because there are win-win things out there, and then there's also things we need to think about with policy, enabling environment, and hard decisions we need to be making, right? And then I think the other piece, and I really do want to move us to the discussion, I think the other piece I wanted to capture is we are really excited and believe that agriculture is the only sector versus transport, energy, and others that has the ability to be part of the solution. Only agriculture can actually be a source of negative emissions and actually has the ability to sequester carbon and be part of the solution. And so we really want to look at where and how we can capture those possibilities. And then the last thing I just want to end on and open it up is the excitement of youth and really mobilizing, and why I'm here, engaging with this audience is the thoughtfulness around how to connect these dots, how to communicate them in a more streamlined way, and then how to mobilize, youth out in communities, I agree, beyond Washington, beyond, where these UN discussions are happening, and have individuals and young people really understand the decisions they're making and what they can do to make a difference. Thanks.
Super, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to begin the discussion period here on stage, and I'm just going to ask my friends here about their opinions on some issues for a little while. Melissa mentioned the Paris Accords. I'd like to talk just for a moment about budgets. We obviously can do a lot in a voluntary fashion to deal with this issue, but we do need money to carry out programs. And it is a little scary when we open up the newspaper, as we did on November 4, to see the announcement that the United States was beginning the process of pulling out of the Paris Accords. Chuck Hagel mentioned a lot about leadership in his talk, and this to me is a broad leadership issue. Now, this is a very broad policy document, but one cannot help but really wonder what impact a statement like this has on budgets available for these sorts of programs and leadership that our country can show. So I'm wondering, do we have any intel among us about what impact you think that this will have on budgets? Phil, I have another special question for you, so I'll ask Kimberly and Melissa about this first. What do you think about this?
Do you want me to start? Go for it. Sure. Well, when it comes to our budgets, I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind. One is, especially under this administration, when the Trump administration recommends that we cut 30% of our foreign aid or many other areas, it does not mean that Congress listens. In fact, most of the time with this administration, people don't even pay attention anymore to the budget requests. It is up to congressional support to determine where we put our funding. And as Phil mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of true bipartisan support for issues around food insecurity. And there's a lot of interest of how that connects into climate change. Was that last night? The night before last, I hosted the former Prime Minister of Tanzania. Sue was at this dinner. As we were talking about the role of fruits and vegetable nutrition in Tanzania, a report that we launched, we had some congressional staff there. And their follow-up to me was, we want to continue to keep moving on this issue related to climate change. Great. So we're planning now, working with congressional staff, thinking through and giving them guidance on how we can continue to be leaders on this. Because the truth of the matter is, when the U.S. is a leader, or when it steps back, it makes a huge global impact. Mm-hmm. It makes a difference whether the United States is stepping out and really grabbing that mantle and making big policy decisions, because money does sometimes follow that, or whether we're seriously taking a step back and what that means for other countries. So we'll see how it shakes itself out exactly in the numbers, but I am pretty hopeful of the leadership and the support that we see in U.S. Congress on these issues, on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Excellent answer. And I think I just want to add that there is so much work going on in so many places, and this is such a complex issue, that I don't think this work is going to be ending anytime soon. We may not have that broad sign-on, but we should feel good that Feed the Future is working on so many of these issues, on ag development, on water, on natural resources, on gender, on nutrition. There are so many United Nations food-related agencies working on these issues. The CGIAR, which is a series of research centers across the world, is deep into these issues. I heard the other day that a dryland area multi-center program will be started. I used to serve on the board of ICARTA in the Middle East, so this was very important to me. There's so much knowledge about how to navigate in drylands, and as we get drier, we need to know more about these things. So I really wanted to make that point. I am curious if you think that foundations could do a bit more, and about the private sector. I was heartened at the last Paris Accords, I believe, that the private sector, although there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm about the accord, several private sector companies got together and said, well, that's fine, you guys, but we're going to go ahead. We've already started to do some things about climate change, and we're not going to stop. And this was signed by CEOs of many private sector companies. So we tend to think only of the public sector money available, but I think we should think how we could get more foundations involved and what the private sector. Did you have a comment on that?
Susan, I think that's true. I think the private sector, especially in the agriculture space, there is going to be in the coming decade a lot of commercial responses to this, and some of them will fly and some of them will nosedive, and not everything that comes down the pipeline is going to make sense. But to Melissa's point, that agriculture is a contributor, but is also holds the potential to be one of the greatest carbon sinks and the greatest ways to address CO2. And the challenge is, how do we get those incentives right, and how does the private sector line up to make that happen? How do we measure carbon to make sure that once it's in the ground, it stays there? All those, and how do you ensure that farmers are incentivized to play a role in that? Not just farmers in America, but farmers all across the country to engage in climate-smart agriculture. So that's really exciting to me. I do want to loop back a little bit. Kimberly, you said that these programs get cut, but we have strong support in Congress, and we do, and particularly for the handful of line items that I watched, the administration has zeroed them out, and Congress comes back and replaces them, and that's all fine and good. But I wouldn't want people to think that that's a zero-sum, hey, Congress saved your bacon, no harm, no foul sort of situation, because as someone who's administered programs like that, when they're zeroed out, you begin to wonder, what's your organization's commitment to this? And it puts your organization on its heels a little bit. So I am extraordinarily grateful for the bipartisan, bicameral support we have for those programs that are important to us. But I just want to make sure that people understand there's a little opportunity cost when shenanigans like that happen.
Very hard for organizations to do strategic planning in a situation like that. Melissa, just quickly, you mentioned before when we were talking prior to this about a group that is going to stay engaged despite the official declaration about. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Happy to, and I just wanted to reply back on the leadership question, and then happy to talk also about the non-state actors work. I think the point I just wanted to add in about the implications of us pulling out. Budget is important, but I think it's also vision, strategy, and coordination and integration, right? So I think the budgets in some ways, as Kimberly noted, are not as terrible as you would think for food security things, for landscape work, for some water programs and multilateral support. But you can have 1,000 books in a library, but it doesn't mean you have knowledge or you know what to do with all that information. And you can have all the ingredients for a really amazing souffle, but not know how to put it together. And so the leadership and vision that we need, and where the U.S. shows that leadership globally to other countries, and then really mobilizes what are we trying to achieve. It's not the amount of dollars, it's the amount of vision and to what end, and how do all the pieces fit together, because this is a cross-cutting issue. And I think we're really lacking that, and everyone's sort of working under the radar. We've got EPA, you have USDA, you have international stuff, and we're not functioning on all cylinders, and so we're not going to achieve much, even with budgets sort of mostly intact for the individual little programs, not little, but programs. So that's the one point I want to make, and that's political leadership, that's leadership to drive innovation. We're going to lose our cutting edge and really climate-related technologies, energy-saving technologies, regenerative ag technologies. Those are the future. of where we can also be driving economic growth for our country too. So that I feel like we're going to get hit hard. And China, I just was telling the panel in the green room that I just came back from China, and their leadership is stepping up to fill that void globally when we are stepping back. And what will that mean for innovation and company investment, et cetera. So that's one thing. And on the non-state actor thing, I think there is a movement that NGOs like ours, but not just NGOs, we've got Walmarts and Coca-Colas, you have churches, you have academics that have signed on. In 2017, there was a movement called We Are Still In, WASI, WASI. You can Google it, and it truly was this organic thing when Trump announced he was going to pull out, and we weren't attending these state actor things 2 years ago. This coalition formed, and it's been meeting in parallel, kind of a shadow group in line with the state actor thing. There was a climate summit on the margins of the UN General Assembly in November in New York. And so there's over 3,800 sign-ons, and like I said, everything from Joe's Coffee in Bozeman to Walmart to the universities of California.
Excellent.
And the idea is that if you do look at the collective of the commitments of what these entities are making to reduce their emissions across whatever entity they are, in line with keeping a 1.5 degree future, it is as much as a global economy. And so there's so much happening in the US, and then we've got WASIs in Japan and in other countries that have formed as a result. But it's not enough. I think we still need the state commitments. We still need to institutionalize this. We still need government leadership. But it's WASI is an exciting movement for sure. And then one other thing you didn't ask, but I'll mention, is that in the corporate side, there's a real platform where companies are making public and substantive commitments on their emissions reductions. And so the IPCC recently put out a more urgent plea to companies that they need to be much more aggressive in getting their own emissions reductions down by sector than what they've already been committing to. This letter came out and was signed by all of the IPCC. And then the Business Council had a response to that saying, yes, we totally get it, and we need to sign on. So there is a platform, again, that NGOs like ours, but not ours alone, have created called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this was started, more than 5-6 years ago. And now companies, again, like Walmart, et cetera, but not only, it's sectors beyond ag, are saying, we have done a calculation of what our current footprint is, and here is our commitment. There's been lots of modeling exercises and showing the allocation of emissions and emissions reduction targets by sector, and then by company, given your share of that sector. And so there's over 700 companies now that have made these public commitments that get vetted and approved by the SBTI board, which we are included, and then over 70 of which are food and bev companies. And it's global, it's not just US companies. And so that is a real public place where companies are signing on to make these commitments.
Excellent. I love the democratic process involved there. That's beautiful.
But they're moving ahead. This is not a government
anyway.
legislative thing.
Yeah.
They are asking because they want to be held accountable and be known on record as responsible entities.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Just one quick other budget question. Phil, I know that food assistance is expensive, and it's been targeted for cuts recently, and I was just wondering about how that's impacted your funding levels and your planning for WFP.
I think the executive branch proposal in recent years has taken a pretty big whack, and Congress has come back in a bipartisan way and restored a lot of that money. And there are resources flowing to World Food Program from the U.S. government, from the private sector. But it's going to take more, and it's going to take longer term commitments to get done some of the things that need to be done. In many of these places, I tell people what the importance of having a reliable stream of money. You think about delivering food aid in pick an African country that might need food aid, and if you wait and dilly-dally, you can't take it in by truck, you have to bring it in by aircraft. And you know how much more expensive it is to bring stuff in by aircraft than by truck. So just having that predictability in budgets across the board is hugely important.
I know there's a group called the Friends of the World Food Program that's extremely effective in advocacy.
Yep.
So I hope that they've got your back and keep you going.
Well, actually, that's WFP USA
Yes.
is the new brand of Friends of the World Food Program.
Okay, great.
So,
Great. Well, I'm
So-
learning so much today. We talked about leadership a little bit when we were talking about budget, and leadership is a very important variable. Not that we haven't existed without leadership. I'd like to note that, global food security wasn't a very big priority until 07, 08, when we experienced the world food crisis. Not only in our own country, but in many countries, people woke up a little bit, said, we haven't been worrying about this for about 20 years, and that's been a mistake. We're falling behind. And so there was a lot of work and a lot of advocacy in our country. We had the Global Food Security Act authorized, and it's a good thing we did that when we did, because now we're fairly secure. In 07 and 08, I think we were allocating something like $241 million to ag development. Now the Global Food Security budget is over $1 billion. So these things can be done. We can take action. But leadership is really very important, and some are saying that without more leadership on this whole issue of climate change and food insecurity, that we can pretty well plan on another world food crisis coming up here pretty soon. So I'd like to hear from you all about leadership. And Melissa talked about this a little bit, so you probably have said your statement on this, but where do we need to do better on leadership? And, but also, are there places where you think that the United States really is good as a global leader and that our work could be enhanced to put ourselves out there more as a global leader?
I've said a lot already.
Either of you two?
I'll jump in because you bring up the 07, 08 crisis. I think not a lot of people know that outside of our little food security bubble, right? And during that time, there were up to 40 different urban riots all around the world, lots of different continents, cities, countries, and that's what really woke up both our government and many others. It was that linkage to political instability. It was that linkage to national security issues. That is something that will wake up a policymaker, because when it comes to our national security, people understand that becomes in their self-interest, and they want to make sure that we do what we can to protect ourselves. I think that's a fine argument to make to get someone on board to understand why to tackle food insecurity. What happened in that particular case was we had President Obama, who was a real leader on this issue, and went to the then G8 summit and not only committed that we as our country was going to invest a certain amount of money to tackle this, but then that galvanized a lot of other countries. What's been interesting, I think, since then, and this is where I think there's an opening, I could talk about in the sense of, maybe before I go into the opening, I'll say the Global Food Security Act that Sue was referring to, you should just be aware that right now, your taxpayer dollars are going to spend about $1 billion a year to support a program called Feed the Future, which focuses on now 12 countries around the world to help improve those root causes of hunger and poverty and malnutrition. And a lot of that programming does focus on climate-smart agriculture, whether that's helping improve farmers' access to drought-tolerant seeds or having them understand better agricultural practices to deal with climate adaptation. There's a lot that's happening that's really smart, that's really good, and is making a huge difference in a lot of people's lives. But what I want to say is I feel like we're at this moment. Matthew mentioned at the beginning about, the teenager who's sort of making this movement. You brought up youth, and I'm so glad you did, because the amount of climate protests we've seen, the amount of young people who are latching onto this and recognize that this is urgent, this is now, is really impressive and something that we can build upon. And then you look at the presidential election that's going on right now. In 2016, climate change was not a part of the discussion. Now it's a major part of the discussion. I remember being in Seattle for work and turning on the TV, and there was this CNN town hall on climate change where every candidate was up, talking about things. And to hear candidates talk about crop rotation, I was like, what is happening? This is so amazing. But it's because they were speaking our language, but it's because young people and others recognize this is an issue, recognize that the US government, no matter what happens, which party or whatever happens in the election, that we're taking this seriously. And that to me is where we've got some momentum that we can sort of look at the success we've had through programs like Feed the Future, look at how it's in our best interest and how this relates to the United States, and look at our leaders and our future leaders and impress upon them and keep them accountable that we are taking this seriously.
I think we need to get all these young people with their energies involved in the World Affairs Councils, right?
That's right.
That's a good opening.
Can
Melissa?
I build on that?
Sure.
Because I agree with what Kimberly was saying, that there is a sea change, and that I think the piece I want to build off of, I agree with everything she said, and that we definitely need leadership with the capital L, and that we need to move beyond a partisan dynamic around this. And I think that's the piece. I feel like we need a little L leadership too, right? In the sense that this is not you're a Democrat or a Republican, or you are an environmentalist, or a not, to say that we need to mobilize around integrating and tackling this issue. And so the leader and leadership that I want to just highlight is Rick Clark, who is a farmer in Attica, Indiana, 7,000 acres. He does livestock and row crops, soy and corn, but is a regenerative ag farmer, not because of climate change, because of his business bottom line, and because he is trying to maintain the long-term viability of his main farm asset, which is his soil, and that will guarantee his long-term yield, his financial viability, and it all ties into resilience and climate change, the kinds of practices he's doing to reduce his footprint and not use inputs and to do cover cropping, et cetera. And so he and I have talked, and I feel like his discussions with me, he is the biggest advocate for the kinds of things as a conservation NGO we are trying to roll out in ag. And his traction and challenge is that he is having trouble in his ag and farm community for this not to be something that his colleagues in the ag community feel is partisan, or it's something that they should all be moving, and he doesn't understand why, but he's getting more attention outside of Attica than he is in Indiana. And so, and yet he's got an American flag waving on his business card. He's a real Indiana farmer. He's not someone from California. He's not, an environmentalist. He's doing large scale ag. So I've met several farmers like this, and what will it take in leadership to transform the ag sector? And then the other meeting I'll just add, we had earlier this week was with 7, 8, 10 venture capitalists who are managing farm assets in the United States, who had themselves organized and found that there was a gap in wanting to certify sustainability in their assets. So they, in the last few years, are taking it among themselves to identify and certify themselves what they believe is sustainability, how it does or doesn't impact climate, and then they're trying to push it out to companies and the producers that they work with and the assets they are managing, because they are proactively, for the same reason Rick is, because it's not just about efficiency and price and cost, it's about maintaining the long-term asset, and they know sustainability of economics, of the physical asset of the natural resources is so important, and they want to start to value that as they are looking at their investments. Super interesting. They are exhibiting leadership, and it's not coming from regulation, it's not coming, and it's a different part of this system. And so I feel like we need to connect the dots and show leadership of how all of these pieces fit together and how we need to row. It's not if and when climate change, it's happening. What do we now do about it? And how do we create a better culture and a win-win positive solution, so we quit saying, I can keep my head in the sand and I don't need to do anything about it because it's a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. Sorry.
Well, that's super. I wanted to talk, we want to leave 15 minutes for discussion, and this is such a fun discussion. We don't want to end it really, but I want to talk just for a moment about some connections, because there are some key words here that I think we could be using in a way to start the conversation with policymakers and with citizens who are worried about certain issues, and then we can bring it back to our issue. One key word, of course, is political instability. And Kimberly talked about this earlier, a very hot issue that people care about, and it relates to national security. Another key word is linkages to conflict. Taxpayers are very worried about the enormous amount of money that our country and other countries spend on trying to resolve conflict. How can we work on the front end to prevent some of these conflicts? And the third key word is migration. That was mentioned. I'm with you.
I got an answer for you, Sue.
Goody, I'll be right back.
All right.
The other key word is migration. Migration is a huge key word these days in the United States, and in many countries it's causing stresses on so many systems. But what are the triggers in our area that are really pushing migration? So, Phil.
Well, when you mentioned stability, last year we did a publication here, Winning the Peace, Hunger and Instability, and I would just, if anybody wants to take a dive into it from an academic perspective, reviewed a whole bunch of peer-reviewed articles to kind of help lend a little more scientific heft to the nexus between hunger and instability. And so I would just recommend that for anybody. We've got an executive summary, we've got bigger things, they're all available on our website. But there is a nexus between that, and when people like General Mattis and others start talking about hunger as a multiplier of risk, I think it behooves us all to very much pay attention. You talked about leadership. One of the things that I think so many Americans don't appreciate about our leadership in agriculture in the United States goes back to Abraham Lincoln's era, when we founded our land-grant university system, something that we've all begun to sort of take for granted, but really holds a lot of the keys in many ways to addressing some of these issues. And this country has done big things before. If anybody wants to go back and watch the movie by Ken Burns about the Dust Bowl, you realize that in the Roosevelt era we had these enormous dust bowls that were ripping apart the country, and livestock was dying and terrible things were happening. And out of that came the Soil Conservation Service, and we collectively said, okay, we need to do some leadership here. And did they get it right all the time? No, but we have done big things before, and we can do big things again, I guess is my hope.
Excellent. Just one final point, and I'd quickly, Phil, I think I'll ask you to address this one too, because I know you've done some work on this, and that is the whole area of humanitarian assistance versus/and development. I read on your homepage that in the last decade, almost half of the World Food Program emergency and recovery operations have been in response to climate-related disasters at a cost of $23 billion. Wow.
Yeah.
And, in our dreams, the people sitting on the stage, of course, we'd love to have enough money for development, to develop folks to be resilient and to not have to deal with these horrible crises. We know that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I know that your organization has changed its model somewhat in the recent past and is now also working on the development side. Do you want to talk a little bit about that shift?
Yeah, certainly bridging that humanitarian development divide sort of gets to the point I made early on about we need to find ways to address root causes and build resilience so that you don't have to go back in every time, so that when a farmer has a bad year in Guatemala, they have enough resilience so that the next year isn't just compounding that badness. And so at WFP, and I think from our U.S. Government standpoint too, you look back to the Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy era, most of our food aid to deal with global hunger was in the form of commodities. And that's important for people in America and people in the breadbasket, I think, to contribute commodities. But we also more recently have discovered through the Global Food Security Act that you need to have the right tool at the right place. And sometimes commodities aren't the most efficient way to deliver aid. This food for assets process about, yes, give people food, but in return have a project that supports their long-term stability. So the range of innovation in food security is just amazing when you think back from the 50s of being commodities. Now it's everything from these resilience programs to ready-to-use therapeutic food that you feed children when they're on the cusp of starvation. There's just a lot of innovation going on, and
excellent.
So I'm cautiously optimistic about all that.
Excellent. As you can tell, all the people on the stage are very passionate about what they do and very well informed. We could probably go on all afternoon, but we want to reserve some time for questions. So let's start that now. We have 2 mics, and I think we'll do kind of the same as we did during the Hagel lunch lineup. And if you could please state your name and your organization, and keep your questions concise. Make sure it's in the form of a question. And if possible, if you have a special person to whom you would like to direct that question, please state that as well. Okay, we'll go over here first.
Yes, thank you. Mary Beth Bergeron, Western Massachusetts World Affairs Council group. I have a question as to whether or not any of your organizations research and other food service organizations internationally that are very successful. For example, there's an NGO in India called Akshatra and that in 10 years, or 20 years rather, they went from feeding 1,500 children a day, and today they feed 1.8 million children a day in India in exchange for the children coming to school. That's obviously a win-win all the way around. There's an educational factor as well as a food factor, and clearly these people knew what they were doing. Granted, they were an NGO, so leave that. And then the other question I had is sort of something I've read a couple of times, and that it was suggested that perhaps more of us eat meat less, you know, whether that be chicken or fish or beef or goat or whatever, because they take away from the grains that should be available to people, and of course they create gases that are damaging our climate. So that's a twofold question, and anyone can answer. Thank you.
Who'd like to tackle that one?
Do you want
Kimberly?
us to get a couple, or want me to go ahead?
I'd start in on the,
We'll go one by one,
on
I
the
think.
school feeding thing, because that's something that WFP does in a lot of places around the world, and we do it, Americans support it through the McGovern Dole Food for Education program. So we do that. I've seen some really cool things in countries where they try to integrate, do local and regional procurement as well to sort of begin to build those value chains in countries. And also places where we've incentivized, you know, in some patriarchal societies, people don't send their daughters to school. Well, so we incentivize it so that if, you know, for instance, they have 80%, their daughters have 80% attendance rating, they get additional take-home rations. It's amazing how much that will incentivize in some places people to send their daughters to school. And what happens then is they get married later, they're less likely to get pregnant, just a whole bunch of things to complete their education. So how you structure that is wildly important, I think, and so I'm glad to hear that they're doing it in India, trying to get that going in other countries. I had lunch the other day with the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. They're working on right now some baselines to measure how much this is going on all around the globe and what's the investment from host countries as opposed to just donor countries. And I think there's emerging evidence that a lot of host countries are saying, hey, school nutrition programs make sense. Let's do more of that. So I'm hopeful that is the message we'll get after they get done with their research.
I have to mention, I'm sure you would too, the Eat Lancet report that came out this year. It's called the Eat Lancet report, Eat as in EAT, from the Eat Commission. It's one of its biggest recommendations was to have people eat less meat. And I do say oftentimes, especially when I speak to young people, one of the greatest things you can do for the climate is to change your diet. Now that doesn't mean that I think everyone has to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but I do think we need to be more conscious about the role that livestock plays in terms of both its emissions of greenhouse gas as well as its land use. The IPCC report that came out this year on land use was very clear that our current agriculture use of land is unsustainable, and we're going to have to make some major large-scale changes because a lot of this comes back to consumers as well. You know, I mean, I love that most of us like, who ate here today? Because we don't think a lot about how we eat, where our food comes. It's changing, I think, a lot, especially with younger people. But this is going to affect the cost of food in the supermarket. This is going to affect how farmers, both the smallholder farmers in the developing country that I think most about, but also the farmers like she's talking about in Indiana, and it's affecting us now. And I think the way that we should look at how we eat and what we eat is one way that on a very individual level you can make a contribution, and how food systems and agriculture can be a solution to some of these issues.
And as we learned at your workshop, eating more fruits and vegetables is very
That's
good
right.
for you, right?
Can I just jump in? I want to make a quick point about food loss and food waste.
Oh,
because
yes.
Excellent. We haven't brought that in yet. Very good.
That's a big
gonna be
piece
yours?
of this equation. And you know, if the CO2 emissions attributable to food loss and food waste were their own country, you know where they would stand? number 3 behind the United States and China. So all of us collectively, and in America and other rich countries, food is kind of fashion. But so whether you go vegetarian or do whatever, just waste less. I think
That's something we all can do.
Yeah.
It's funny because I appreciate you're not in a conservation organization, or maybe more strongly prescriptive on what and how we should eat. I think we're a little measured at WWF for various reasons. So statistics I'll throw out. So 96% of mammals on the planet are humans or livestock for human consumption. So when we think of saving iconic species, it's like 4% of the biology on Earth is actually the wildlife that we are thinking of the biodiversity, right? Most of it are pigs, cows, poultry, right? Tens of billions of those. And so it is a huge footprint. Agriculture roughly is 1/4 of the emissions. 2/3 of that is for animal ag. So agriculture is the largest driver of degradation on the planet, whether it's water consumption, water quality, whether it's land conversion, impacts on natural habitat. So yes, agriculture has a big footprint, animal ag especially. That being said, I would say it's a nuanced and a complicated story on, is meat good or bad? I think in the US, it's pretty easy and clear, and in markets like the US, that for health reasons, forget the environment, but for your health, on average per capita, we're probably eating too much red meat, but meat in general. We don't need that much for our own health, and it's actually causing us to have health issues. And I'm not a nutritionist, and we're not a nutrition organization, but there's lots of studies and data on that. But in other parts of the world, oh my gosh, hundreds of millions, more than half of India needs more animal-based products.
That's true too.
Because they're malnourished and they're not getting the right quality. It's not just meat or not meat, it's the quality of the amino acids, the quality of nutrition. And in many parts of the world, we need to up the uptake of animal-based products, right?
Let's get some of the
so
other folks
I just want to
chance
say it's
to,
nuanced, and that I think I agree with Phil as well. We have a lot of things that contribute to reducing our footprint here at home.
All excellent points. These are not exactly
Food
simple
waste and
issues.
loss is a huge one.
Let's
here.
take a question over here.
I'm Amy Gregory from the Naples, Florida Council on World Affairs, and I wanted to address what's a little closer to home in terms of Florida, and that's the area of the Northern Triangle countries. The World Wildlife Fund did a wonderful study, David Reed, your executive summary, on that part of the world, and also the effect of the terrible immigration policy of the United States at this time in that part of the world as well. No coffee, no water, no irrigation, no solutions, no changes in policy with immigration. Tell me what you see that's going to make it better. Thank you.
Do you want to
Should we
take
get
that?
a few more comments maybe first, or do you
Questions? Wow, thank you for
We
that.
can work through some more.
do you want to do some more questions?
Want to take a
Take
couple?
2 or 3,
Okay,
yeah.
we'll take another question from over here.
Okay, sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Go ahead, yes.
Hi, I'm AJ Pena from the
Oh,
Peoria.
I can hear you really well, thank you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm AJ Pena from the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. You guys talk specifically about what we can do individually in terms of what we would deem as ethical consumption, but I'm curious at the extent that you guys believe that does make a difference, considering that the Carbon Majors report demonstrated that 100 companies emit 70% of global emissions, and in terms of the precedent necessary that the Paris Climate Accords demonstrated to have a global coalition of people to combat climate change. By 2030, almost all of the countries involved currently aren't even going to be meeting those standards. In fact, India and China are going to be raising those standards. US is already abysmally low standards, especially with them pulling out, and Russia didn't even have a standard. So what can I do as an individual to hold these current standards feet to the fire and actually make an individual difference outside of just eat less meat? Because individually, that doesn't solve the infrastructural issues.
Who wants
Vote.
to? Who wants to take that?
Yeah.
Phil, do you
Participate in
wanna-
the process. I think, did anybody see recently I think she was an Australian parliamentarian, a young woman who's like 26 years old, and she was giving a speech on the floor of Parliament, and she got heckled by somebody, and she barely broke stride, and she says, "Okay, boomer," which is like the big slam that Gen X will lodge against us if we don't pay attention to these issues. So, and we've seen Greta, the young woman from Scandinavia, calling attention to these things. So there are things that people can do to sort of get the attention of policymakers, and that's exactly what needs to happen.
Are we taking a few, or I?
Nope.
Ditto, that's all I have to say.
Go ahead, Melissa.
I just, on Northern Triangle, thank you. In the back of my head, and I stopped myself when we were opening up to questions, I think you could, that immigration issue in our country, the source of it, you could argue, is very much related to climate change. It's conflict, but the seeds and roots are very much related to a lot of the issues, whether it's from disease and wiping out coffee, loss of livelihoods, all of that. I don't know that I have a crystal ball of what's the answer. I just think that an organization like ours, but not ours alone, are working in those regions to try to address, as Phil noted so aptly so, that we need to get at the root causes, not just stem the triage. And so, yes, we have, a challenging immigration policy, whatever, but nobody wants to see how desperate, this flood of desperate people coming to our border. So yes, we can figure out what we need to do to change immigration, but I think the underlying thing that all of us care about is none of those people want to be coming and through such terrible conditions. Why can't we help support creating the environment that would allow them to stay and give them the opportunities they need? They want to be at home. So that's the kind of work we do, but from a conservation lens, but it's very much to address the root causes, so we don't see that kind of immigration. We don't work on immigration policy. And then on yours, I feel like the thing I just wanted to mention is that you said 100 companies contribute 70% of the footprint, and we all say agriculture consumes 70% of the water, and so farmers are tired of being the bad guys. The companies aren't nameless, faceless things producing stuff out in the ether. It's stuff that we buy. It's things that we demand. It's a market they think they are filling. And so whether it's food or anything else, and I myself, have to question, do I need that pair of ear pods? Do I know what it costs to make them? We are in a throwaway, we overconsume everything, not just meat. And so clothing, it's the largest landfill thing. So I think it's everything in our choices, and not just you, but where and how. Circularity, recycle, we don't have a federal policy, the infrastructure to aggregate and accumulate materials so that we can keep them in the system. I feel like there are a lot of structural issues, and this is where the connecting of the dots. We need to first say, we believe this is a problem, and let's work together to solve it from a systems point of view with complexity needed. And we need youth and smart people to connect those dots, because right now people are in their short silos, short time frames. So,
let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more questions.
Lightning round.
We've got about 2 minutes, so let's see if we can get another couple of questions.
I'm Joshua Flores from the Penn State University. This is for a question
What did
for
you say,
Phil.
Michigan State?
Penn State.
Oh, Penn State. Okay, I couldn't hear you
my
very
alma mater.
well. Thank you. I was just going to cheer if you said Michigan State, but go ahead.
So for Phil Karsting, what would you say to those that criticize the effectiveness of foreign aid through the use of NGOs and IOs?
What do I say to those who criticize it? From an American perspective, 11 of our top 15 trading partners were once food aid recipients. At the end of the Vietnam War, they barely bought any American products. Now there's 7 or 8. And USAID just came out with a study that suggests that developing countries are export markets for U.S. agriculture, which is probably where some of this criticism might come from in some ways. They bought $90 billion in stuff from us in 2018. So I just leave it at that. The reality is that stability in global systems is good for all of us, and that's something you talk about our lunch conversation. We need to be thinking in 100-year time blocks and not 2-year time blocks. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's take one final question, and then we'll have to go.
Hey. I got cut off last time, so I hope I get to ask this one.
Dear.
My name's Orman Derek. I'm from New College of Florida with the Sarasota chapter. My question is, as a young person, as kind of my other colleague asked, we don't have a lot of hope that this is going to get done. A lot of us don't even plan on retiring. We think the climate's going to collapse. We think we won't even have money to retire. All of that good stuff as us young people in the 21st century. I'm a public health student as well, so I'm very interested in the policy aspects of it, of contingency. So what specific policy recommendations do you guys have that we can work with the case scenario that we won't meet that 1.5 Celsius target. We won't do these things. Like, even if we meet the 1.5 Celsius target, there's still going to be climate catastrophes. These things are still going to happen, just not at the super high impactful level that we're all fearful of. So what specific policies should we be looking at and kind of working for to kind of recover from that, and especially help the most vulnerable, like in the Northern Triangle, just because the migration that's causing that is really rooted in climate change and all the other things that we're seeing today, not something that's 12 years down the road, 10 years down the road, something that's happening today. So.
You want to take hers too?
You want to take
What policy recommendations?
When we get
Yeah, what,
Okay,
like, what
one last
specific
question.
policy recommendations?
I have not heard very much about small agriculture in local areas as part of this discussion, and the use of farmers markets, even here in the United States, the importance of supporting them enough so that their products are not that expensive and more people can afford to buy them. And secondly, how about running sheep and goats on your property to mow your grass the way I do and have for the last 6 years?
Cool. Nice.
Actually, I want chickens in my backyard, but I haven't worked that out with the condo next door. It's the same kind of thing.
Responses?
I don't want to go first on
I
this
feel like on the I don't think there's one set of policies. I feel like the only thing I can say to allude to how complex things are is that we have Farm Bill, we have nutrition, and then you have a bunch of environmental policies, right? And at best, they don't add up to a strategy to deal with food systems to get to these win-win-win things we need for nutrition, for climate, for nature. But at worst, they're working at cross purposes, and that there's oftentimes perverse incentives that are incentivizing bad things in one place. So it's not one policy recommendation. We really need to rethink what is our goal and what is the government's role, and then let's look at cross-sector sets of policies and what things need to be changed. And so I think we really need to think of a systems approach. And then where are the limits of what a government at a federal level? There are other things, as I noted, at state and local level for circularity and the decentralized nature of infrastructure development for recycling, right? Or for things like that. And so that stuff isn't only policy, and then how do you incentivize innovation in private sector, et cetera. So it's not simple, and I feel like when youth ask, what can they do? You know, we are partnering with universities, and when we talk to the academics and the professors teaching these cross-cutting, really big, weighty issued classes, they say, yeah, there's interest, but then 90% of their graduates go on to Wall Street or business degrees, or, you know, so your smart minds need to be engaged in these complex problems, and then, or do you default and go make a lot of money? Because that's, you know, I know you have to pay student loans. So that's the challenge, and I'm sorry you're inheriting a really crappy future, but no, I mean, I'm serious. It's like, it's really, but there is so much interesting and cool stuff to be done, and you can also be part of the solution, both, you know, politically, but also on the systems innovation change. You can still go in the private sector and do good too. That's
Well, to conclude today, thank you so much for your questions and for your attention to our panel today. Yes, I think we've all learned today that food security and insecurity and climate change really involves a complicated set of issues. To our young people, I would say try to get involved on your local level and maybe through your World Affairs councils, and just try one issue. This is such a huge area. If you want to work on the issue of water, go for that. Learn how to be a policy advocate, learn how to write your congressman, learn how to get involved just in any of these issues, food waste, water, all of the kinds of issues that are comprising the larger issue. And I am so thrilled about this upcoming work with the World Affairs Councils and WFP, and I look forward to really hearing about how that develops in the future. So
and
thank
being
you.
Involved, I hope, Sue.
Wow,
and being
okay.
involved. I just have to, a little bit of an echo chamber. I have some announcements too, so please stay with us. First, I commend this panel for an incredible job on an important, complex, multidimensional topic. They really prepared. Kimberly and Melissa, your expertise are just mind-blowing, and the efficiency and the depth that you brought to it is great. Sue, masterclass in moderating. I wish all our moderators were like you. And Phil, we so look forward to working with you in 2020. The support for this conference means a lot to me and to the organization. You're bringing to light such an important issue. I look forward to the RFP that will go out to councils. So we will select some very good destinations for you to put together what I hope will be a lot of good partnerships too with many organizations, World Food Program, USDA being one of them, and local, national, perhaps international. So thanks everybody. Now the announcements. Yes, applause, of course. Sharp, sharp panel.